When a patient gets discharged from the hospital, we all think the hard part's over. But what if it isn't? What if the toughest part of their recovery has nothing to do with medicine at all? What if it's just about getting home and all the trips they have to make after that? We're about to look at a healthcare plan that's perfect on paper, but in the real world, it pretty much just tells patients, good luck getting there. Okay, so this single sentence, this is where it all starts. It's buried deep in an emergency room report. Sounds kind of dry, right? Almost like administrative fluff. But this one little note, it's the key that unlocks this massive, hidden problem in our healthcare system. It's about a breakdown that sends so many people right back to the hospital, not because the treatment failed, but because they just couldn't travel a few miles to keep it going.
So, to really get this, I want you to meet Sarah Chen. She's a hospital case manager, and her days are spent staring at spreadsheets, trying to coordinate patient care. But not too long ago, she started noticing something in her data, something she just couldn't shake. A really troubling pattern that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with geography.
What Sarah saw was, well, it was startling. She's looking at all this data on 30-day hospital readmissions, and the same zip codes just keep lighting up, over and over. They weren't random at all. They formed this really distinct ring around the outer suburbs. And she knew these areas. She knew them as transportation deserts, places where if you don't have a car, you're pretty much stuck. Data tells one part of the story, but it's the people that make it real. Take Mrs. Rodriguez. She's back in the hospital for heart failure after just 18 days. Why? Couldn't get to the pharmacy. Or Mr. Thompson, readmitted in 22 days for his COPD. He missed his big follow-up appointment. And here's the kicker, the common thread. They lived less than 2 miles from each other, and both were stranded because they had no way to get where they needed to go. And this really gets us to the heart of the problem. We're calling it the 2-mile canyon. It's this idea that a distance that looks so small on a map can become this huge, impassable chasm for someone who's sick and trying to get by in the real world. Look at a map. It's just 2 miles from home to the specialist's office. Simple, right? But on the ground, for someone who's just had surgery or is fighting a chronic illness, that short trip can feel like an impossible journey. So why? Because the real world is just full of these barriers we never even think about. You can't drive after an operation. The closest bus stop might be a quarter-mile walk, which, let's be honest, might as well be 10 miles if you're struggling to breathe. There's no direct bus to the clinic anyway. The pharmacy, it's in one of those strip malls you can only get to by car. The whole point is, our suburbs were built for speed, for cars, not for people walking, and definitely not for people who are sick. And this isn't just about a few individual people. This whole thing pulls back the curtain on a massive systemic issue. It's about how our healthcare system keeps creating these perfect discharge plans that just run headfirst into a brick wall, a dead end.
The process seems so logical, right? Step 1, you diagnose and treat the patient. Step 2, they get better, you discharge them. Step 3, the plan says follow up with your doctor in 7 days. But that's where the system's logic just completely falls apart. Because the landscape, the real world, basically says, good luck with that. The plan just assumes there's a bridge to get you to that appointment, but for so many people, that bridge just doesn't exist.
And here's the thing, this problem is actually getting worse, and it's because of this huge demographic shift that's been happening. Over the past generation or so, poverty has been moving out of cities, where there's usually pretty good public transit, and into these suburbs that are completely dependent on cars. So we've got more and more vulnerable people stranded in places without the basic infrastructure they need to survive.
Now you're probably thinking, okay, but aren't there services for this? And yes, there are, but they are a total patchwork. You've got Dial a Ride, but you have to book that 3 to 5 days ahead of time. Doesn't really work for an urgent follow-up, does it? Medicaid transport is an option, but the rules are so complicated people don't figure them out until it's too late. And volunteer drivers, they're absolute heroes, lifelines, but their waiting lists can be months long.
So what happens when the system fails? Well, that's where people like Sarah Chen have to step in. She and other case managers are basically forced to go way, way beyond their job descriptions to improvise a safety net, one person at a time.
She essentially becomes a logistics operator. She starts flagging high-risk patients before they even walk out the door. She's on the phone with their families, trying to explain how incredibly important that first follow-up is. She's coordinating with paramedics, tutoring patients on how to navigate the maze of benefits. She's even spending her own lunch breaks trying to confirm that a ride is actually going to show up.
And this whole improvised system is just so fragile. Some weeks it actually works. A daughter moves her work schedule around. A neighbor offers to drive. But other weeks, a ride just falls through. a pharmacy closes early, and the gaps in the system just completely swallow the best-laid plans.
So what's the actual impact of all this? I mean, the stories are powerful, but the hard data, that's what shows you the real scale of this problem. This transportation gap has a very clear, very measurable bottom line. When Sarah finally tallied up her numbers, the result was just stark. Patients in these suburban areas who don't have reliable transportation are readmitted to the hospital at a rate 40% higher than their peers. Let that sink in, 40%. That is a huge and honestly a preventable difference. And yeah, this has massive financial consequences. In Maryland, for example, there's a state program that actually ties a hospital's payments to their readmission rates. If the rates are too high, they get penalized. We're talking up to 2% of a hospital's entire inpatient revenue is on the line. So this isn't just a human tragedy. It's a multi-million-dollar financial problem that hospitals literally cannot afford to ignore.
At the end of the day, what Sarah's work really does is it shines a spotlight on this invisible gap in our healthcare system, a gap that exists between the clean, orderly world of medicine and the messy reality of a person's life.
Let's just call it the real gap. It's that space between a perfect clinical plan written on a chart and a person's actual, real-world ability to follow it. It's the distance between a bottle of pills sitting behind a pharmacy counter and the hands that physically cannot get there to pick it up.
And this really gets to a core, dangerous assumption. The medical system just operates as if this bridge from the hospital door to the patient's home and back again is just there. It's a given. But for millions of people, that bridge was never even built. This just brings it all home, doesn't it? When you look at it this way, you realize that for so many patients, the most important factor in their recovery isn't some new pill or a fancy procedure. The difference between getting well and getting sick all over again is something as simple and as vital as a passenger seat. So we want to leave you with this question. We're so used to measuring health in clinical terms, in blood pressure and lab results, but maybe we need a new way to measure it. Maybe the real distance between sickness and health isn't measured in lab values at all, but in miles, in bus routes, and in sidewalks. Maybe it's measured in our ability to finally close that gap.